You say, but in the process, aren't we polluting the atmosphere? Aren't we responsible for pollution by all of this manufacturing and all this energy development and by using fluorocarbons and hairspray and whatever? Aren't we all doing this? Don't we all need to take responsibility? And isn't it affecting the temperature? Well, look, first of all, I'm not the expert on any of this, so I've had to do some work to figure all this out. Here's a good start. Caltech, fairly trustworthy scientific place, at the top, really. Caltech Michelin lecture. And in this lecture, given by Michael Crichton, he says some very interesting things about global warming. He says, the fact that the scientific community does not rise up and protest the false science of global warming means they have been politicized or postmodernized, and there is a crack in the scientific door and pernicious garbage is seeping in. Whew. That is a pretty serious statement to make at Caltech. This is not science. The ploy, he says in this lecture, used by postmodern politicized pseudoscience is consensus science. What is consensus science? It goes like this. A large group of scientists agree. Oh, is that how you do science? By vote? He says this, consensus science is not science. It is extremely pernicious. It is the first refuge of scoundrels, and it is the way to shut down debate and real science. When you hear consensus of scientists agree on anything, you have been conned. Grab your wallet. It's going to cost you. He goes on to say the work of science has nothing to do with consensus. Science requires only one investigator and researcher who has found the facts. Consensus is irrelevant. If it is consensus, it is not science. Consensus is invoked only in situations where there is a political, social, financial agenda without scientific support. For example, he says, no one says the consensus of a large number of scientists is that E equals MC squared. You don't say that about that because that's a fact. You don't need a consensus. You would never hear this. The consensus of a large number of scientists is that the sun is 93 million miles from the earth. That's a fact. Consensus has nothing to do with it. You don't vote on facts. You find them by the scientific methodology. He goes on to say, once you abandon strict adherence to science, anything is possible as people are unscrupulous and manipulate for their own ends. And all scientists know this. Skepticism is the soul of science. Skepticism is the soul of science, not consensus. Anti-consensus. There was a Danish scientist by the name of Lomborg a few years back who wrote a very important book published by Cambridge called The Skeptical Environmentalist. That's right. A scientist wrote a book called The Skeptical Environmentalist and debunked all the environmental pseudoscience. He was vilified as a heretic by Scientific American Journal. He was outside the bounds of the game. So folks, whenever you hear about a consensus of scientists, you know there's no evidence. Now what about some facts? Well, as far as we know, we've only been measuring this for a few decades. The Earth's temperature is up about 1 degree. What does that prove? that it's up a degree. That's a scientific fact. From where it was 30, 40 years ago. As best we can tell, from 1940 to 1970, it was cooler than it's been from 70 to the present. So it has gotten a little warmer. But we really don't know how many times that's happened in the past, because we don't have any way to measure that. We do know that in the Middle Ages, don't have temperatures for it, of course, but there was a period which all agreed was called the Little Ice Age because everything was very cold, it seemed. So, the temperature is up 1 degree. Do we extrapolate from that 200 years from now it's going to be up 20 degrees and the polar caps are going to melt and drown all the world? There's no legitimate science to indicate that whatsoever. It fluctuates up and down, and the best science and the latest science, and this is important, tells us there is a direct correlation between sunspots and climate change. And sunspots are visible and discernible. So that solar variations drive temperature. The sun is the source of temperature changes with its infrared variations which are discernible. They can see them. And by the way, there is absolutely no scientific evidence that CO2 or carbon contributes to warming. None. No evidence. Actually, the opposite appears to be true. Here's how it works, and I've reduced this to a layman's level. The sun gets hotter. It fluctuates. It gets hotter at some times than other times. As the sun gets hotter, it warms the oceans. As the oceans are warmed, they release more CO2. So sun determines the warming. The warming then affects the oceans so that they release more CO2 into the atmosphere. The point is this: it's not us putting CO2 in the atmosphere that warms the climate. It's the sun that warms the climate, and the ocean puts more CO2 in the atmosphere. And all honest, legitimate science, from what I read, says that the human contribution to CO2 is negligible. Water vapor, clouds, make up almost all CO2. Climate change, then, is the effect of electromagnetic fields on the sun that increases CO2 from oceans and clouds. And the claims of the environmentalists that we're increasing the amount of CO2 and therefore warming the environment has no real scientific support. And then the scare tactics that if we keep doing this, we're going to melt the ice caps and we're going to have 20-foot sea surges that are going to drown the cities. Really? Turn to Genesis 9. Genesis 9 and verse 7. As for you, be fruitful and multiply. Have babies. By the way, there is an organization with a really funny name. Can't remember it. But it advocates that everybody stop having children and consider suicide to save the planet. But anyway, here in Genesis 9, verse 7, as for you, be fruitful and multiply, coming out of the flood. By the way, I just want to remind people that there is one who can destroy the earth, and he did it with the flood. He did it. Devastating. But out of it, after the flood, of course, came a new ecosystem. So there's a reissuing of the original command, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. It's just repeating the fill it up command of Genesis 1. Then God spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. And I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. Is that clear enough?